The thing that I think about most when I think about Sadowsky basses, and we'll jump around a little bit, but is the active, or I shouldn't say active electronics, but a preamp involved. How did the preamp sort of come into your world?
Yeah, good question. In the late 70s, I had attended 3 Gibson service seminars in Kalamazoo, where they were looking to train people to be authorized repair guys. I think the corporate suits knew at that time that that Kalamazoo was going to be history at some point. And at those interviews, I met a guy named Ron Armstrong, who came out of the Olympic crowd in San Francisco, and with 2 other guys started an outfit in San Francisco called Stars Guitars, and they were making hardware, you know, brass bridges, all that kind of stuff, and they were making active circuits. So Ron encouraged me to try some of those, and I had a customer, a New York songwriter, bass player named Tony Kniff, who was just looking to cut better in the mix when he performed. And so I decided he was my first guinea pig. And I installed this 2-band Stars preamp with just a treble and bass boost. And the feedback I got from Tony was just tremendous in that he felt for the first time he really could hear himself in the clubs and in the rooms he was playing. And just by serendipity, the next guy who came in was Marcus Miller. And he brought me his 77 jazz bass, and he said, Roger, I want you to do everything you know how to do to make this the best bass it could be. Mm-hmm. And so Marcus was getting into the jingle scene at that time. And so I retrued the fingerboard, refretted it, put on a Stars Guitars bridge, and installed my preamp. And I was a little primitive at that point about routing and routing with templates and all of that. So I installed it by just picking out some wood on the drill press from the front of his bass and making a big pickguard extension to cover it. Yep. And so that guitar is somewhat historic in that regard. I'm not proud of that giant pickguard, but it worked. And then that's where it all took off from. And before long, I was installing preamps for Will Lee and Neil Jason and all the top New York guys. And it was like, for the first time, they were sitting great in the mix like they had never had before. So I never set out to be a bass maker, but what I brought to the table with this on the bass mods I was doing, really just, you know, I use the expression, I rode the horse in the direction the horse was going.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always found that interesting because in all our discussions, you know, we would probably talk about acoustic guitars more frequently than anything else. And, you know, like that's the passion, and you're sourcing wood in the same way that for fretboards and bodies that you would put that kind of attention into an acoustic guitar.
Well, all those studio guys, or most of them at that time, had fabulous vintage guitars. I was working on a lot of early 60s Fenders and late 50s Fenders and 50s and 60s Gibsons. And I was doing a lot of modification work to these guitars. And when they were done, some of them were exceptional and some didn't seem all that better than when I started. And I tried to figure out what was going on. And I reached a conclusion that the instruments that sounded the best acoustically were always the one that sounded the best amplified. Plus, the ones that sounded better acoustically always tended to be the lighter weight instruments. So by 82, I had really focused my hypothesis that electric instruments are first and foremost acoustic guitars. And I started selecting my wood accordingly. And I'm still convinced that that's the case. I mean, you see all these guys demoing on YouTube how the wood has no effect on the sound of the guitar, but it does. And even if it only does to the player, that affects how he responds to his instrument. It's so intertwined, but that's the way I approach all my electric instruments.
Yeah, I mean, I think proof is in the pudding. You know, when customers come back for their second, fifth, seventh instrument,
Yeah.
you're onto something.
Yeah, and I've also become convinced that the fingerboard has a bigger effect on the tone than the body would.
Yeah.
I can hear the difference between maple, ebony, and rosewood so much easier than I can between alder and ash.
Yeah, that I guess the thing that I would see the most in the shop was, you've got piles of fretboards coming in and you're really looking at them and listening to them, tapping them, looking for the straightest grain, all that kind of stuff. That had a big impact on me, that it wasn't just throwing stuff together.